Life in Transition, a short story companion to the forum. 5 moments, 5 turning points, one shared thread of becoming. Part 1. College Graduation. The Empty Room. A story of the first morning nobody tells you to wake up for. Nobody warns you that the finish line is also a door. Mara stood in the doorway of her dorm room for the last time, watching dust drift through a slat of morning light where her desk used to be. 4 years of accumulated life, string lights, a corkboard fat with ticket stubs, the coffee-stained syllabus she'd never thrown away, now folded into 6 cardboard boxes stacked in her mother's trunk. She had expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she felt like she'd been evicted from her own becoming. The group chat had gone quiet since finals ended, each friend scattering to a different city, a different next thing. Deja had a job in Chicago. Priya was moving home to figure it out, which everyone understood to mean something heavier than the phrase let on. Mara had an offer from a marketing firm 2 states away and absolutely no one to have dinner with when she got there. At the graduation ceremony, a dean had said something about the world being your oyster, and Mara had almost laughed out loud because oysters, as far as she understood them, were mostly shut. It was her father who found her sitting on the curb outside the emptied dorm, phone in her lap, not scrolling anything. "You look like someone told you the party's over," he said. "Isn't it?" He sat down next to her, knees cracking. "The party where somebody else built the whole room for you? Yeah, that one's over." He nodded toward the parking lot, the boxes, the version of her life not yet assembled. "This next one, you build yourself. Takes longer to get good, but it's actually yours." Mara didn't feel better exactly, but she felt seen, which was its own kind of relief. 3 weeks later, alone in a studio apartment with mismatched furniture and a lease she'd signed with hands that shook slightly, she hung the one string of lights she'd kept from the dorm. It didn't look like much. It looked like a start. She texted Deja, "First night in the new place. It's ugly and small and mine." Deja wrote back almost instantly, "Send a photo. Also, I cried on my kitchen floor last week. So, we're doing great, clearly." Mara laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. She took the photo. Crooked lights, bare walls, one folding chair. It wasn't the room she'd imagined, but it was the first room she'd ever made without anyone's help. She sat in the one chair for a long time before she got up to unpack the rest. Part 2. Divorce. Half the House. A story about what's left when the shared life is divided. Some rooms you have to learn to be in alone before they feel like yours again. The couch was Elena's. The bookshelf, still half full of Marcus's backpacks, was hers too, technically. The divorce agreement had been generous about furniture, less generous about everything else. She stood in the living room at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, the hour that used to mean someone will be home soon, and let herself feel the particular silence of a house built for 2 people, now holding one. Her daughter Priya, 16 and furious with both of them in ways she hadn't yet learned to name, was at Marcus's apartment this week. Elena had signed off on the custody calendar with a steady hand and cried in the car afterward for 20 minutes before driving home. Everyone had opinions about what her life should look like now. Her sister said travel. Her coworker said dating apps, obviously. Her mother, who had stayed in an unhappy marriage for 40 years out of principle, said nothing at all, which was kind of its own judgment. What no one mentioned was the particular strangeness of grocery shopping for one. How her cart, out of decades-old habit, still filled itself with Marcus's favorite cereal before she caught herself and put it back. On the nights Priya was with her father, Elena had taken to eating dinner on the back porch instead of the dining table built for 4. It felt less like a demotion and more like an experiment. What do I actually want when no one else is deciding it with me? 6 months in, she was still finding out. Some nights, the porch felt like exile. Other nights, like tonight, with the last of the summer light going gold over the yard she'd fought to keep. It felt like the first honest room she'd had in years. Priya called at 7. "Mom, Dad burned the pasta again." "Of course he did." Can I come home early? Elena's chest did something complicated, grief and relief in the same breath. Yeah, baby, come home. She set 2 plates instead of 1, out of old habit, then put one back, out of new practice. The house wasn't whole, but it was increasingly hers. Imperfect, half furnished with someone else's old books, and quietly, stubbornly, becoming livable again. Part 3. Empty Nesting. The Last Suitcase. A story about the silence after the door finally closes. You spend 18 years building a life around someone, leaving well. Renata had rehearsed this morning for months without meaning to. Every time she folded a shirt into her son's suitcase, every time she caught herself calculating how many family dinners were left before the number hit 0. Now, the moment had arrived anyway, indifferent to all that preparation. Diego stood by the car, 6'2" and trying not to look like he might cry, which was somehow worse than if he had. Mom, it's 4 hours away, not the moon. I know, Renata said, and meant it, and still felt the words land somewhere just left of true. Her husband, Tomas, was unusually quiet on the drive home. They'd spent 2 decades organizing their lives around soccer practices and college applications, and a boy who needed rides, needed forms signed, needed them. Now, the car was too clean. The radio played a song neither of them chose. So, Tomas said finally, merging onto the highway, what do we do now? It wasn't really a question about the afternoon. Renata understood that. The house, when they got home, was the loudest kind of quiet. Not sad exactly, just unfamiliar. Diego's door was open onto a room stripped of posters, the outline of years still visible in faded paint where tape had been. Renata had expected grief. She hadn't expected the strange, disorienting freedom underneath it, the recognition that she hadn't chosen a single thing just for herself in longer than she could remember. She stood in the kitchen, and for no clear reason, took out the good wine glasses they only used for company. What's the occasion? Tomas asked, amused despite himself. No occasion, Renata said. That's the whole point. They ate dinner at 8 instead of 6, at a table for 2 instead of 3, and talked, really talked the way they used to before every conversation ran through a schedule, about a trip they'd always said they'd take once the kids were grown. It wasn't erasure. Diego's absence sat in the room with them, real and aching. But so did something else, quieter and slower to arrive. 2 people remembering who they were before they became only parents, finding out there was still someone there. Part 4. Menopause. The heat that isn't weather. A story about a body renegotiating its terms. Nobody tells you the body keeps changing chapters long after you thought the story was set. Vivian woke at 3 a.m., drenched, again, the sheets damp beneath her like she'd been caught in a storm that existed only inside her own skin. She lay still, waiting for it to pass, doing the math she'd gotten unfortunately good at. 48 years old, 11 months since her last period, and somehow still surprised every time her body did something new without asking permission. At work, she'd started keeping a small fan at her desk, tucked behind a plant so no one would ask. Her colleague Denise, 29 and lovely and entirely unaware, had once said, laughing, "Vivian, are you always hot?" And Vivian had laughed along, because the alternative was explaining something Denise had no framework for yet. Her doctor had been kind but rushed, offering a pamphlet and a prescription and 11 minutes of a 15-minute appointment. Her husband, Frank, tried, genuinely tried, but there was a particular loneliness in trying to describe a fog that had settled over her own thinking, a memory that used to be sharp now catching on names and dates like fabric on a nail. It was her sister, older by 6 years and 2 years further into this, who finally said the thing that helped. It's not you falling apart. It's your body renegotiating the whole contract. Nobody tells you there's a renegotiation. They just tell you about the hot flashes and let you think that's the whole deal. Vivian turned that over for days. Renegotiation. Not decline, a different word than the one culture kept trying to hand her, the one about fading, ending, becoming invisible. She started saying it out loud, carefully, to the people who'd earned the honesty, to Denise eventually. I'm not always hot. I'm in menopause. It's a whole thing. Denise's face did something complicated. Surprise. Then a visible recalibration, and said, "Thank you for telling me. I had no idea what that actually looked like." That was the part no one had prepared Vivian for, that saying it plainly might do more work than suffering it silently ever had. The heat still came, unpredictable and uninvited, but she stopped apologizing for the fan on her desk. She started, instead, keeping a second one for anyone who needed it. Part 5. Retirement. Tuesday, no alarm. A story about a man learning who he is without a job title. After 40 years of being needed at 7 a.m., the hardest part is discovering who you are at 7:15. Harold woke at 6:58 on his first Tuesday of retirement, out of 40 years of habit, and lay in the dark waiting for an alarm that would never go off again. His wife Diane was already awake beside him, watching him with the particular patience of someone who'd read the pamphlets about adjustment periods and was trying not to say so out loud. "You don't have anywhere to be," she said gently. "I know," Harold said, and got up anyway because 40 years of getting up had never once asked his permission. The house, retired alongside him whether he liked it or not, had rules Harold had never noticed until he was suddenly subject to all of them, all day. Diane had her routines, the garden, her book club, a rhythm to her mornings that had been built quietly around his absence. Harold hovered in the kitchen at 9 a.m. with nowhere to be, and Diane, without meaning to sound sharp, said, "You're doing the thing where you watch me load the dishwasher." "I'm not," Harold started, and then realized he absolutely was. He'd spent 4 decades being the man other people called when something needed deciding. Now his phone was quiet by 10 a.m. most days, and the silence had a texture he didn't have a name for. Not sadness exactly, more like the ache of a muscle no longer being used for the thing it was built for. His old colleague Sam, 2 years retired, had warned him, "The first 6 months, you'll miss being needed more than you miss the actual work." Harold hadn't believed him. He believed him now. It was his granddaughter, 9 years old and unbothered by any of this, who accidentally cracked something open. She asked him to help fix her bike chain, a small, solvable problem, the kind Harold used to hand off to subordinate without a second thought. He knelt on the garage floor for 20 minutes, grease under his fingernails, and felt something settle in his chest that had been unmoored for weeks. Needed, just smaller, just his now, instead of the company's. He started volunteering at the community bike co-op the next month, not because Diane suggested it, though she had, gently, several times, but because his own hands had told him what he needed before his mind caught up. The alarm still didn't ring at 7, but by 7:15, most days now, Harold had found something worth getting up for.